episode 120 on WSLL, Silver Lining for Learning. Here we are with Michael Horn, who Chris and Punya and Young, who couldn't be with us. He's fighting the fires in Oregon today. He wants to be with us because we're going to hear from Michael Horn, who I've been familiar with for about 15 years, ever since this book came out, Disrupting Class with Clayton Christensen, some Curtis guy, Curtis Johnson, great name. But Michael's with us, the middle author on that. And since this time, when I didn't know who Michael Horn was. I'm wondering what this guy from the business school at Harvard and MBA is talking about schools, And, what has he got to say about schools? Well, we found out he has a heck of a lot to say about schools, and he'll be talking about that today. And maybe his new book that's come out, he'll be maybe mentioning that from Reopen to Reinvent. And maybe he'll get us in talking about his newsletter, The Future of Education, which you can subscribe to. And I am getting subscriptions because I'm reading every day what better school tests would look like. Jan Zuckerberg, head of education, Reinventing Learning podcast. Schools can do more than return to normal. Schools should offer year-round schooling. Multiverse, apprenticeships, and the future of work. What the Academy is all about. Reinventing school, reasons for optimism. And on and on and on, including the multiverse and the metaverse and using pandemic lessons to reinvent education. All that we can talk about and more. How in the heck, Michael, do you keep track of it all? I'm serious. I'm getting all these. I'm like, I've got to learn this, and I got to learn this before Michael comes on the show. And I got to learn a little bit of this. So to fill in the gaps from what I've said there and bring us up to date. Anyhow, did the book actually come out? Are you signing it? Before we go into some questions with you.
Yeah, you bet. So I actually during the pandemic, I would say I had this realization. I really like writing. I really like speaking with people, and I might as well lean into it because I think my unique contribution in the education space, I've been with some operating companies, as you noted before we went live with Guild Education and with some education studios and so forth. Been a ton of fun, but I think where do I add value is talking right at that higher level and trying to persuade people that there's a better way to do schooling, that we can focus much more on mastery-based learning and things of that nature. So the book is out, came out in July, traveling a heck of a lot now. It feels like the pandemic never was with us, it's still a little weird for me, but it's been a heck of a lot of fun. And I'm teaching now in Chris Didi's shoes, I guess, although I will say it's rather intimidating, but I'm teaching at the Harvard Graduate School of Education now. And so I'm using my class to frankly learn also from all the students. It's a little trick that Clay Christensen taught me, that the professor gets to learn just as much as the students.
Well, it sounds like you're having a great experience as you move along with this pandemic. I mean, I've been coping with by running every day. You've been coping by reading every day and writing every day. And we're all reading your writing. So, how, as a writer, do you have any, we'll start with something on the side. Do you have any tips for other people to how you became so prolific as a writer? I mean, a couple of things you might want to discuss or share with us.
That's a great question. I think the first thing is I read a lot, right? In the mornings, I make sure I'm reading through all the digests, all the papers that, influential thinkers are putting out. I'm trying to push my limits. And then when I speak, and I speak a lot, I love speaking. I love being on podcasts. So guests or others, they push back on me, right? Or, I remember when Disrupting Class came out and Chris Didi said, I like these three things, but I think you got this wrong, right? And then, tell me how, right? And that helps me evolve. And so I see mistakes or failures as all of us getting better and approaches. So I think have that humility as you write, number one. Number two, learn from others and read a lot, because good readers, I think, help the writing. And then three, set aside large chunks of time to write that's uninterrupted, because I think you really need to wrestle with the messiness of ideas to sort of get through their complexity. Because if you just sort of write it at a high level or the PowerPoint level of business school, sometimes you don't really deal with the messiness of a lot of these things in the real world.
So was part of your evolution within this education space, moving into the blended space, seeing it as, some of the maybe mistakes or ideas that maybe morphed into something else, kind of evolved and showed up in the book you did with Heather Staker in the the blended book.
Yeah,
And
I love
you're
that
a
question.
couple of papers too you wrote about blended learning that were highly cited. I cited them as well.
Yeah, I love that question, Kurt. So it's interesting because disrupting class, I feel like, was, as you noted, right, a bunch of business school people coming into the education space. And I think in some ways it's refreshing how we don't have the language of the space. But then we got to research the phenomenon we were writing about and really get deep with the schools. And so we put out, I think it was 3 or 4 papers around blended learning with different taxonomies of what's going on in the field, tracking 100 case studies, right? And learning. And we made a lot of mistakes in the early ones describing it, but each one allowed us to sharpen that taxonomy and ultimately come out with our book, Blended. And I pinch myself every time because we didn't, the idea was to get stuff out, get the field to react to us, learn, improve, and then that resulted in the book. And frankly, from Reopen to Reinvent's very similar. Diane Tavener and I started a podcast, Class Disrupted, during the pandemic, where we were taking parent questions and teacher questions in the field and doing podcasts on them. And Diane's she's not a co-author in the book, but she really is a co-author in the book because her ideas are laced in every single chapter of something I said. Gosh, I just feel like we're slipping back to normal. This is driving me nuts. I hope some educators do something better.
Kurt, you're muted.
Yeah, well, I guess we see the evolution of our own thought when we look back at our books that we've written, right? And the reading that went into all those tombs. So Chris has a couple of questions for you, Chris.
Well, I want to begin by saying how pleased my colleagues and I are that you're joining us. And it's just wonderful having you teaching with us. The students are really excited. You're bringing a set of ideas that I think will be valuable for everybody. And I know how busy you are, so thank you for making the time to do this.
Thanks, Chris.
Disruptive innovation was a big addition to the repertoire of understanding change. And when I teach about change or do a talk about change, I contrast evolutionary change, transformational or revolutionary change, and disruptive change. And it's clear from the failures of evolutionary change and transformative change that we should be investing more in disruptive change. But it is tricky to apply outside of the competitive situation in business to things like school districts that kind of have a guaranteed income whether they're doing well or poorly. And the suggestion I made about improving disrupting class is that higher ed is the market that's much more easily disrupted than K-12. So I want to talk about the pandemic, and let me tell you my take about it from the point of view of disruptive change, and I'd love to get your take. Just for our audience, and Michael, I'm sure you can explain this better than I can, but in disruptive change, you identify a niche of people who are not well served by the current system. You come out with something that's really completely different as a way of serving them. It isn't very good when you start because nothing is perfect when it begins, but you work without competition and it gets better and better and better. And as my colleague David Rose would say, when you get everyone at the margins, you get everybody in the center. And all of a sudden, it's taking on the current system and winning because it's had this chance to grow unimpeded. Now, if we had had a less intense pandemic, I think it would have been a really interesting opportunity for disruptive change, even in K-12 education, because all the people who were immunocompromised or who weren't doing well in school anyway, or who, this, that, and the other thing, all those people at the margins could have had a mechanism for doing something different and getting better at remote learning. And then eventually, remote learning as a hybrid model would be able to challenge the system. The problem is that the pandemic was really bad. And so everyone was thrown into doing this disruptive innovation. And while people in distance education knew what to do, most people didn't, and so they did it badly. And we spent a lot of time on this program trying to convince people that remote learning is not ineffective and evil, and that if we just go back to where we were before the pandemic, we're throwing out the baby with the bathwater. So the problem is signal and noise. That there is a signal of very successful remote learning that this program celebrates, but it's being lost in the noise of all the people that are clamoring about learning loss and so on and so on. So I don't know what you think about that analysis from the standpoint of disruptive innovation, but where do you think we should go from here, given either the way that I've framed it, if you like that way, or a different way, if you want to reframe it in a different perspective?
Yeah, so I'll say a couple things. One, when you made the point about disrupting class, as you know, I have agreed, and I've gone way more into higher ed until this back into K-12 with From Reopen to Reinvent for two reasons. One, I learned over time how dependent the K-12 system was on higher ed. And if it was innovating toward the wrong, if higher ed was producing the wrong outcomes, and the definition of good in K-12 was that which gets itself into, quote unquote good, but it's actually flawed in higher ed, you really got to change higher ed first. And then to your point, it's a real market. There's actually non-consumption, whereas in the United States, there is no non-consumption of schooling in K-12 education. Now, I think where disrupting class got it right, I guess, but I'll talk about where that was a problem in a moment, was that the disruptive innovation we said was not of schools as a result, but of individual classes. Fair point, Michael Clay and Curtis Johnson, but they're then a nested disruption. So they're growing up within a time-based system and having to fall into all of the value propositions of the old system rather than redefine the system. So in some, I would say in many ways it proved disruptive innovation correct, but it's limited, right? I think much more promising is some of the work that we're doing with Imagine Worldwide, a nonprofit where I'm the founding board member, where we're doing tablet-based learning where there's no schools in emerging markets to prove that students can become literate and numerate, right? In very different ways, and getting outstanding results, I would say, by the way. That I think is going to be more promising in the long run. In terms of your analysis of the pandemic, I largely agree with it as well. I think the positive is, if I were to try to find the silver lining and be part of the podcast, then I think I would say disruptive innovation plants itself in one of two places. One is the non-consumption, and the other is where people are overserved by the existing system. And I would argue, counterintuitively, the overserved people are those with the most resources often, and they don't need all of the one-size-fits-all offering, if you will, of the traditional comprehensive high schools and so forth. And so they're delighted with these things called micro schools, because then, they get a little learning there 2-3 days a week. They do a little remote. They start to patch together their music or their performing arts or whatever it is, right, for their kids, and really customize that. And I think the one promising thing, if you will, potentially coming out of this is because, and this is a different theory from the Clay canon, is jobs to be done, because we took out the habit of schooling for so many families. So many people have now felt far more unencumbered to customize and pick these alternative schooling options that we're still trying to figure out how to categorize and talk about, right? And so we know from Titan Partners that roughly 1.5 million students enrolled in a micro school or learning pod last fall. We're going to find out what the numbers are for this fall, but I think I think that's a really interesting space to watch. I don't know how much it'll grow. I don't know what the ceiling is on it, but I guess my analysis is sort of like 60-70% are like, thank God that remote learning experience is over. but 20-30% are sort of like, I really dug that. And that's on top of the people that already sort of dug these alternative forms. So I think marginally we come out slightly better on this road to a learner-centered world. Gosh, it's slow. And I guess, From Reopen to Reinvent is not a book about disruptive innovation. I'm sort of proud that I think I only used the phrase once in the entire book, I think. But it's trying to say like, hey, districts, if you were to reinvent, here's a bunch of tools and ideas that you can do it with and manage innovation more successfully. But there's no guarantee that they'll do that. So I hope that 20% or so that have found other solutions can gain some momentum, to your point, on the fringe, Chris, and maybe change this conversation. Because otherwise, the irony is our past success of universal schooling in this country that was so powerful to our development is that which holds us in place and sort of prevents us from innovating.
Well, we're going to switch over to a question from Punya, but before we do that, the audience that's going to watch this show will be in awe of your mind, but as well your voice. Your microphone is so excellent. I can see why you love podcasting. Punya and I have bought microphones too. I got mine sitting here, a Yeti one, and Punya's got his there. I don't know what Chris is using, but we're jealous of what you've got. Punya, you want to jump in here with the question?
Kurt, you gave with one hand the compliment and took it away. You praised his voice and then you praised the dang technology. No, it's his voice. All right. Our problem is we can buy as much technology as we want. It's not going to make a dang difference because it's the fundamental flaw there. Anyway, Michael, great to have you on Silver Lining today. And I think it builds on Chris's question and some of the things that you have said. And, the name of your new book is From Reopen to Reinvent, Recreating School for Every Child. And it's the word every that I want to sort of hear you talk about a little bit, because at some level, one of the biggest challenges of education has been, your colleague Rose has written about it and Zhao talks about it. I have sort of talked about it and written about it, is this idea that, of this jagged profile, that there is no such thing as an average person. And so when we talk, and that's been the goal. I mean, if you look at UNESCO's next whatever, we had an episode on that. And so I want you to unpack what you mean by every, and particularly because I think when we have had some amazing innovators on our show, and one of the things that stands out for all of them or many of them is this real care for each and every child. But that's always within the ambit of their community, their school, that nobody should fall through the cracks. But I think you are sort of arguing for something of a bigger vision. So I would love to sort of hear you, your thoughts about when you say every, how are you thinking about, every, while keeping in mind that unique individual, which is, I think, part of the tension there, right?
Yeah, I totally agree with the question and I love it. And I've frankly, a lot of the moral underpinning is based on yours and Todd Rose's and others' writings, right? About how we need to shift from the zero-sum education system in which we've been stuck, where we have the sense that for every winner, there is a loser, and that there is scarcity to be doled out in terms of success, to a system where it's positive sum, that each child succeeding and learning who they are to become in the world actually helps fuel other students, right? It can be more collaborative, it can be more cooperative, it can be more interconnected. And that's what I'm really arguing for in the book. It's not that competition is bad, but I think competition on one very narrow definition of success is extraordinarily injurious and ignores all that we know about human development. It ignores the reality of jagged profiles. And some people, the couple pushbacks that I've gotten is some people say, well, the system's working if it sorts someone out early in middle school or high school and says, you ought to go to this different track. And I say, well, theoretically, I see what you're saying, except that there's no answer then for that child to be able to develop themselves and find who they are to become and so forth. So I get what you're saying, except that I think we're still leaving those children out of the equation. And I'd rather a coherent, connected education system where, yes, content knowledge is critical, but it's paired with deliberate development of cognitive skills. It's paired with deliberate development of what I call habits of success, but other people would say social emotional learning or character skills. And it's paired with a very intentional incorporation of real world experiences, projects for students to work on, and connection and development of social capital in an intentional way. And in that journey, students can build their passions. And I say build because I don't think that there's a preordained path for anyone. It's something you get to build and develop yourself on this journey and fulfill their human potential. And I want everyone to compete to be the most unique version of themselves that they can be in the world, and that expression in the world. And my sense is we treat education as the way society works, as a zero sum, except if you look at almost every other realm of society, maybe athletics are an exception, but almost every other realm of society, it's a positive sum one in which success actually begets success of others in the system and lifts each boat. And we ignore those principles somewhat perniciously, I would argue, in the current education system. So I don't know if I'm totally answering, but if I went back one more, I would say, well, I'll actually add two other quick things. One is, I think sometimes people say, oh, the system is just not working for quote unquote those students, but it's working for, the upper echelon. And I argue in the book, it's not. Like, I don't think it's leaving to chance the development of their habits of success, their executive function skills, their metacognition, et cetera, et cetera. It's creating a load of stress for those students and making school seem like a game to be won as opposed to an intrinsic journey. So I don't think it's working for anyone in the system is my big argument. And I think we should flip that equation quite intentionally to care about each and every child and them learning who they are to be in this complex, complicated world.
So I have a lot of questions that can follow, but I know others are waiting. But just one quick comment, which is you talked about this model which is based on competition. And I think that at the level of the individual, our system has really been based on a deficit sort of model, right? That these are little people coming in with all these deficits, and our job is to identify a few more of them, and if you see the whole discourse, that's what we do, right? Oh, you need remedial math, or you need, so it's always seen from that rather than a positive potential, which can go in a variety of different ways and will over a lifetime. So thank you. Yeah. Any comments on that?
I'd love to jump in on it because it's something that I think I've evolved on it myself, which is, yes, you want to work on weaknesses within strengths, but you really want to lean in your strengths in life. And you should be able to recognize them and build on them, right? Because that's how competitive advantage in society ultimately is developed for the individual as well. And so that's a wonderful thing. Now, there's a baseline of knowledge and skills. I grant you that I'd like to see children develop. I think we should probably have a more robust conversation in society about what that common base is. But in a mastery-based system, I have far more time to develop it, and I'm not leaving people behind in the course of it. And then I really want to lean in on the development of that individual. And this is the last piece that I think is important. It connects to what Chris and I were just talking about, is we need to leave behind this one-size-fits-all mentality of system. When I look at the district response that I think was most flawed about it, is they immediately assume that everyone should get shoehorned into the exact same experience rather than leaning into the fact that, like, hey, Michael Horn's kids are in a very unique circumstance where Michael and his wife have very deep opinions about schooling and some time to shape that, right? And someone else needs like a lot more support in a very different looking experience. And I don't think we should be so arrogant to just say, my kids are in a Montessori school right now. I love it for them. But I don't think we should be so arrogant to say, like, that's the only way that you can do education. We need to have a much more pluralistic vision that meets different children with their needs. And those can be fluid as well. Like, we should not be having a fixed mindset around that.
Just one quick comment before I think Chris or I think Kurt is next. People often ask me, like, if there was one thing you could change about school, that we do today, one thing. And I always say it is age-based grades. And so the point that you made about Montessori, because the moment you do that, suddenly this thing of lining them up all along one dimension just goes out the window. because then you have a younger kid who might be more advanced in X, but behind on something else, but because there are so many of these jagged profiles, in a multidimensional space, you can't put them into little buckets, which I think once we put that one linear thing of age in the picture, I think it just does so much harm. Because, there is so much research to show in sports and so on that if you're born a certain month, the chances of your going pro are much higher. And that's just because at one point in your life, you were literally a year older than the other kid.
Yeah, and you look at like the success of a Michael Jordan, right? For example, if we treated that mindset, he got cut from the varsity team in high school, right? But he developed. And then he became Michael Jordan, like basketball genius. But can you imagine if we had locked him? Oh, at this point in time, you were not this, and therefore we're going to label you based on your age, and that's going to be your destiny.
Right.
Thank goodness that didn't work that way.
Well, thank you. I know Kurt's. I don't want to monopolize the conversation here, so.
No, Punya, where it was accurate in saying I took back the compliments. I'll put a couple back in before I ask my questions. For those viewers watching later on in the show, you can see that we've not invited many excellent guests. If you have someone like a Michael Horn that you want to recommend to us, send us an email. It's our third season, and we finally bringing Michael in here. I don't know how it took us so long to bring him in. It's been an excellent show so far. We normally end with that, but I don't want to forget that. On January 23rd, 2020, Clayton Christensen passed away, who was the first author in that book, Disrupting Class. And so if you were writing an epistle to Clayton Christensen today, or a letter to him that might evolve into a book, in the first part of that, what would you tell him that you got right in this book? In part 2 of the book, what would you tell him that you got maybe a little wrong? And in part 3, what are new things the pandemic made you aware of? And I want particularly you have to focus on part 3. There are new things that you would kind of walk Clayton through and tell him or teach him or mentor him about. What are those things that have arisen that kind of, if you were to do, instead of disrupting class, disrupting education, the whole 9 yards, what would that be like? So part 1, 2, 3, particular part 3.
I'll try to do the first 2 parts quickly, I guess, given that I think in terms of what we got right, the theories of innovation actually are pretty good. We didn't always, as I was talking with that back and forth with Chris, right? We didn't always sort of understand the implication fully, I think, of when you're doing the nested disruption, you get that right, but there's going to be limitations, even though we're arguing for mastery-based learning without the language, right? In disrupting class, we even have sentences where we say, like, this is not going to work because of X. And we didn't sort of follow that, right, to its full conclusion, I think. And so maybe we were over-optimistic about the capacity for change. I would say, secondly, it is interesting, and I still don't know how to fully absorb this. Maybe one of you will give the answer. But I've talked about, we have this notion in Disrupting Class of the real disruption will be a facilitated network where anyone can be a teacher and a learner in a set of fluid experiences where you'll create and digitally and so forth. We didn't have video in mind when we said it, but several people recently have said, well, yeah, my high schooler learns everything on YouTube. And that is the facilitated network, I think, that has sort of disrupted formal schooling, except we don't know how to credential and certify it yet in the formal language. And so in some ways we got that right and wrong simultaneously, right, if you will, in just an interesting way. More to your last point, what I'm really excited about the new book and the new writings is a much more, you alluded to it, holistic sense of what we're trying to reinvent here. We were very focused on what is now called personalized learning. Incidentally, we never used the word personalized. I think we used customized in Disrupting Class. But we were very focused on the personalization or customization pieces of it. But we didn't talk that much about the habits of success or the skills or all these other things. And so I think just the digging into that more complete picture, or even social capital, like my colleague at the Christensen Institute, Julia Freeland Fisher, her book, Who You Know, I think has taken a lot of the disruptive innovation thinking much, much further as a result of thinking like life success after you get that baseline of what you know is really all about who you know in life. So I just think all these other directions that maybe were blind spots for us, Kurt, are things that I would love Clay to more fully understand and occasionally get his brain on. The last thing I would just say is I wrote a few tributes after he passed away, because it's obviously one of the ways I process things is writing. But one of them was a piece in EdSurge about how Clay was just such a master teacher in line with so much that we know from cognitive science. And I wish I had told him that when he was alive, because I think we could have done a lot more with that, intentionally or unintentionally, had we made it more explicit.
I think I read that. I think I read a couple of the tributes. I have a follow-up question, real quick one. You're 20 to 30% of students who may have really loved the options that they faced or had during the pandemic, kind of aligns with the number I keep sending out in terms of the percent of people who are self-directed in nature. I'm studying self-directed learning. I've done a series of studies over the past decade on SDL, and I often quote 25%. And if we can somehow magically increase the percent of society to 50% or more, and that's probably going to happen given what's confronting us societally and culturally. And
yeah, so sorry, keep going. No, keep going.
I'm really taken with the title of your new book, From Reopen to Reinvent, because that gets us maybe that next phase or that next level, and pushes people's thinking a bit. And as you were talking to Punya, I was thinking, well, I wrote the book, The World is Open. And I want to write a follow-up called The World is Wide Open. So same thing, and I was saying, instead of reopen, be open, from be open to be invent, to have people, the beingness in the world is to invent, education 3.0 or 4.0 is the innovation age, the generating new ideas and new thoughts, new artifacts, and that being celebrated in schools instead of at the old 1.0, 2.0 being taught or being guided. You're getting kids in charge of their own learning, which is really what you're been talking about in your newsletter, and I recommend people subscribe to your newsletter. And you can keep up with Mike, if you can try to keep up with Michael's thinking. But just if you want to comment at all about that.
Yeah, I love the points. It strikes me, I hadn't thought about it before, in the language you just used, around 25% or so are naturally self-directed. I think that actually aligns up with the percent of people who are actually quite good at becoming readers without the explicit instruction in phonics and so forth as well, right? So there's sort of 3 pathways to learn how to read, and that probably matches quite nicely. And then your point, how do we teach 25% more of the population to be that self-directed learner? I think actually that's the idea of embedding these habits of success so deeply in the learning, and that we have a learning cycle for each learner where they are setting a goal, planning how they will reach that goal, learning, showing evidence of the learn, and then reflecting and get to repeat, right? And in my mind, at least, if we can build that as a cycle that students are doing all the time in their learning, a lot more of them are going to start to develop the executive function skills, the metacognition, et cetera, to be that self-directed learner, which I agree, it's an imperative for the world in which we're living, where the half-life of knowledge and skills is, rapidly shrinking, and the need to constantly upskill, reskill, learn through one's working career that itself could potentially stretch on much longer over time, although right now forces are in the opposite direction on that. Out of the pandemic, but that is going to be an imperative. And so the more we can equip people with that, the better off each individual will be, and the better off society will be. These things are in concert with each other.
I like the word imperative, and we'll switch over to Chris. He has a question or two for you, but thank you, Michael.
So, Michael, I want to go back to a point that you made earlier about the fact that higher education really is kind of an anchor around the neck of reform in K-12 education. And That certainly is my experience as well. I'll go out to a K-12 setting, give a wonderful inspirational talk about active learning and collaboration and performance-based assessment. The first question is always, well, when is Harvard changing its admissions standards? And it's a justifiable question. And we've seen, just as we've seen shifts in the pandemic that now people are retreating from. People are retreating from higher education, not relying so heavily on standardized test scores. No, they're going back to the old model. So one of the things that the 60-year curriculum book that I and my colleagues published in 2020, New Models of Lifelong Learning, discussed is the idea that people are going to have a half century or more of working life, and that they're going to have multiple careers within that working life. And then the really effective education is not only targeted to the career that you're currently in, it's targeted to laying a foundation for all the careers you're going to be entering, which is where a lot of these cross-cutting skills, both cognitive and social emotional, find a home. So in a sense, it's also the workplace that's broken. It's employers that are broken.
Yes.
Because if they were smart, they would be saying to higher education, don't give us people who are perfectly prepared for their first job, but know nothing else, which means that 3 years later, they're obsolete because of the speed of evolution in the workplace. And then what do we do? Because if they said we want people who clearly can articulate the passion that's going to be cross-cutting through their careers, who have foundational skills that are important in any career, as well as preparation for their first job, that would really force higher education to alter in ways that could throw a lifeline to people in K-12 who want to reform. So I think some of it, and we're not used to this. I mean, we're used to making a case to parents about K-12. We're used to making a case to consumers and maybe our colleagues about higher education. How we articulate this in the workplace is an interesting question, and I'm thinking that Clay Christensen knew a lot about that as well, and would have loved to hear your thoughts about that.
Yeah, first, I agree with all your observations. So I want to say that up front, Chris. Second, it's something that I've been studying deeply because, frankly, Guild Education, where I was spending the 2 years during the pandemic, is working with large employers on the education and upskilling, connecting that really as a marketplace, connecting them to both higher ed providers that were innovating, but also non-traditional post-secondary providers that were doing the short form skills, and things of that nature. So dug into it a lot. I think it's interesting. First, the thought experiment is governors that are sitting there griping about the stranglehold of higher ed and prices and so forth and want to do all sorts of things. The biggest thing they could do is stop requiring degrees in all their job postings in their state governments and actually mean it. That would, be quite seismic, I think. The second problem, as I've observed it and spent a lot of time on this, is that one of the challenges is that employers are incredibly inarticulate about what they actually want from employees. They don't know what makes a successful employee. Part of that, as you know, is the research on a novice versus an expert in a field is that as you become an expert, you forget 75% or something of all what you needed to do to become that expert. And so the things you say are important. Maybe you're not building the building blocks to be able to adapt and move and be interdisciplinary and so forth. So that's one challenge. But I've come to a very different place on it, literally in the last 12 months. I'm working on a new book right now about why do employees change jobs. I'm not sure I'm supposed to say that out loud, but that's okay. And as we've been digging through that, what we've realized, I was all on the skills-based hiring. I love Joe Fuller's work and people like that. I just don't think employers are going to understand it because they're not going to make the investment in cognitive task analysis to really get at that level. And so where I've shifted to is I think employers should throw out their job descriptions and move much more toward descriptions of what people will do on a daily and weekly basis, and focus on the what are they doing part of it, and then let higher ed come along and say, okay, what does that mean or imply individuals need to have in terms of the skills and so forth. And so actually there would be a layer for higher ed there that would make them more relevant to be the translator, right? And then to help design the programs that actually would meet the employer needs. And I just think we're so twisted right now on this, that employers, they're the end customer, frankly, on all of this. And so for us to unravel it correctly, I think they need to step up to the plate and own this much more. It is interesting that the Amazons and others of the world, Walmarts, et cetera, are doing so much more skills training and building of this stuff themselves to frankly disintermediate higher ed in certain ways as well. And so some of the biggest breakthroughs, frankly, may come from those places on this road. But gosh, if you're a smaller, medium-sized employer, it's a really tough road for you to make that jump, which I think is why if you move to descriptions based on what people do, and frankly, that's what people care about ultimately, right? Like we think we want to be something, but what we really care about is the activities we do and do they align with our passions and strengths? That's where we get energy in the world. So if we could be much more articulate about that, then I think higher ed could lean into the skills-based and we could get better hiring processes that's stopped focusing on the degree and started focusing on, do you have the right stuff for what you're going to do in this job?
I think Punya's going to jump in at this point, unless Chris has a follow-up or anything. Okay, Punya, you want to jump in? Then I'll go after you.
Sure. So I'm going to a little bit of a digression here, and then I'll come to the point. And so there is a method to the madness here. So there's this wonderful example of this GM plant in Fremont, California, which was one of the worst functioning sort of plants that GM had. There were drugs on the manufacturing place. There was like yelling and, people were leaving in droves and so on. And then they did this partnership with Toyota. And what's interesting is that it was 80% of the same people working there, and it became one of the best functioning. And so the point here is that we keep trying to fix individuals in our school system, but really it is the system. So I love where the conversation has been going with Chris so far. So I think it's a sort of a natural segue. And so, recently I went to buy a car and had an experience with one dealership where they were on commission and another one where they were on a fixed salary. And the nature of the interaction was dramatically different because the incentive structure of the system in one case, was about just getting me to buy anything so that they could get their commission. So they're doing the mental math of how long do I spend with this guy, so that I can get the maximum, whatever. The other guy was okay. I'm going to get paid what I get paid and let's have a conversation. And so I'm wondering, in your examples, as you're thinking about this, what are some kind of systemic sort of incentive structures? And we see examples of this in education all the time, right? We put race to the top, and then we find out that teachers are cheating. And then we find out that, we do this testing system, and now we have Proctorio and other things which are like utterly demeaning to students and their education and learning. So it's certain things have gotten baked into the system in some way. And I think some of the suggestions you were making about possibly thinking of employers thinking about it differently, possibly higher ed stepping in. I'm wondering are there any examples that you see where there are an attempt to try to think of a different system where the incentive structures are not this sort of harmful, if I can use that word, right? I'm always sort of curious to see or understand how can we build the system differently, because too often we focus on individual actors or, and so on.
Yeah. So I love the question, and Clay Christensen used to say, people don't do stupid things because they're stupid people, but because they're stuck in stupid systems. And I think it's an important point underlying all of this. And I think when you look at our education system, again, it embeds failure in its design. And it actually goes way back further than testing or anything like that. It's, it's a time-based time-fixed variable learning system. We pay for butts and seats in effect, and we have incentives built around that. And then we've layered on all these clunky other things, and you get more of what you started with, in essence. To me, so I think you're exactly right. I've been taken by a bunch of ideas in this field. Your question, though, is more in like who's doing something differently. I think it's a good question. I'm really taken with, as you say it, the one that pops to mind is the New Hampshire Virtual Learning Academy Charter School, or VLAX. They get paid based on progress that an individual makes over time. So they get 10% of the funding as you master 10%, or, it's a little less crude than that. But and students can show evidence of the learning through a variety of modalities. So it could be a performance-based task. It could be a conversation with an individual teacher, and things of that nature. And so I'm not saying that that's the silver bullet, but I think that's an example of trying to think very differently about what this looks like. I pair that with, say, a Western Governors University that's competency-based or mastery-based, and how they've thought about, hey, there's different kinds of assessments, right? We have those objective assessments that are, fairly narrow, right, and can be scored by a computer. But then we have what we really care about, which is the performance-based assessments. Can you do the work in the field? And they have a totally different set of faculty members who are responsible for assessing whether you have in fact mastered those performance-based tasks. And that allows them to do inter-rater reliability and all sorts of things to get the confidence that they can say to an employer, when Michael graduates from Western Governors University, he in fact can do these things, right? And he actually doesn't graduate unless he can do these sorts of things. So I've been taken by some of these ideas and moving toward them. I'm taken by things that look much more at the individual growth of each child along their trajectory, as opposed to, the big thing you identified earlier, which is, Michael, you were born in the year of the Lamb, and therefore in March of 2023, we're going to test you on this particular concept, even if you did that 5 years ago, or you've never even seen the precepts for it, right? We're still going to test you on that, which is just insane. So decoupling that. And then I've been taken by Jay McTighe's ideas around what a more robust assessment system might look like, that would sort of combine some of the sampling mechanisms from a NAEP-like instrument around the content knowledge that we say students should learn, have a lot of room for performance-based tasks. And by the way, professional development for teachers would be around those performance-based tasks and how you grade them, which might be way better professional development than hiring someone like me to come into a district 3 times a year, right, and drone on about something that's not relevant to what they're doing. And then local-based assessments that really, I think, amounts to creating a portfolio of work that you can show at the end of this. And I'm quite taken by the Mastery Transcript Consortium along that lines.
Yeah, thank you. That's the great example. And I think that at the end of the day, it comes down to how we think we are measuring. And everything is going to get geared towards that. And so getting smarter about it rather than going for what, relatively speaking, is low-hanging fruit, though we know even there matters are far, far more complicated.
Yeah, there is another interesting side of this, right? Which is, I've been a big critic of the existing assessment system and so forth, and you just heard that in my answer. The flip side that I think is a reasonable pushback is that the way our school system has reacted to the tests is a little like how doctors reacted to the realization that blood pressure was an important indicator in the 1800s, which is to say, when blood pressure got high, they said, oh, we got to lower it. So they stuck leeches on you to drain your blood. And yes, it lowered your blood pressure, but it did nothing for your health. And I think that's a little bit been the reaction of schools to the testing regime, which is to say, we got to drill and kill. We got to do test prep all the time. And it might move the needle marginally on a couple points, but actually like real deeper learning is going to really that's what's really going to help students in the long run, is coherent opportunities to engage deeply in learning. And I always find it somewhat ironic that some of those, high tech high, for example, they do just fine in the reading exams. Like they, I know Larry Rosenstock loves to bash them, but like, it turns out their students do just fine. And so I think there's two sides of this. The practice has to not be so reductive, and we can move to a much more robust system of incentives as well.
We've covered a range.
Chris has got a question.
Yeah, we've covered a range of territory, but we still have time for a question from Chris and one from me. So Chris, jump in here.
Well, we've been talking about a lot of really big picture strategic ideas in this program, which is great. And from time to time, all of us as co-hosts reflect on the whole Silver Lining for Learning series, now 120 case studies, if you will, of successful, transformative innovation, often under conditions of very limited resources. And there's a lot of themes that we've talked about today that in a less systemic way have appeared in many of those episodes. And I think that we are getting closer to having a kind of intellectual strategy that's systemic for being able to go after this. But the other side of it is motivation, because it's very difficult to swim against the tide. And one thing that a system is good at doing is having lots of change-resisting feedback loops to make sure that you stay in a line. And I think that the theme on that's come out through Silver Lining for Learning, and I'd welcome Punya and Kurt's thoughts about this as well, is much simpler. If you're student-centered, then you end up doing all the right things. If you really care about the students, more than the curriculum, more than how you like to teach, more than the test scores, then that's the motivation that carries you through and that keeps you going, because you see the results, and the results themselves give you the energy to do the next cycle. So I think that's a piece that is really important as well to consider, is the motivation that underlies the cognitive strategy and the importance of these direct connections with students and direct feedback with day-to-day progress that students are making to keep us all in the game, despite all of the burdens that we face. I guess there's not really a question in there somewhere, except to ask the three of you if you've got anything you want to add to that.
I mean, I think you're right, Chris. And I think the interesting thing is, how do you unleash educators to be able to return to those roots of why they got into the profession in the first place, and try to create the systems and incentives that don't push back on them from doing those right things, because we can't leave it to chance. I think in the end of it, I'll give you another silver lining maybe, and then Punya and Kurt, you probably have thoughts, which is, I alluded to it earlier, this percentage of people that are actually making choices now. For the first time in my memory, the US traditional education system can't take for granted that students are going to be there in the schools. And that is a really big difference. And it's not just, frankly, those well-off parents making these choices. I was talking with a woman, for example, in Detroit, and she helps counsel families out to homeschool, basically. And I said to her, now somewhat ignorantly, but then it didn't feel ignorant, well, how do you know that those parents are going to do the right things, for the kids? And she looked at me in the face. She said, 16% of kids in Detroit can read, Michael. I can frankly do a heck of a lot better than that and open up a world of opportunity. I sat down. That's encouraging, I think.
Wouldn't you have a quick comment before I ask my final question? You're muted,
I think
Punya.
we're tight on time. I know you have a question, so yeah. We can
Okay.
move along.
Yeah. So we're all dying to hear about your muse, because we know you've got one somewhere. in the attic, maybe in the closet. Where and when do you seek your muse out, and who is it? And basically, what are your data sources? And the people who are going to listen to the show or watch this show later might want to tap into those data sources. So can you give us a couple of them that you rely upon for the numbers that you present in your keynote talks, your podcast shows, your books, that they might find this of value?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, I think ultimately Clay Christensen is my muse on the innovation side of it, right? And his theories become, I think it's the standing on which I'm able to do the writing that I do, even as I venture into different fields, because as Chris noted, theories have a lot of explanatory power in different places, and you just have to figure out where the limiting circumstance is, what makes it different, and then understand what it is. And that's the biggest one. I think the second one, Diane Tavner of Summit Public Schools has been very influential in shaping some of my next learnings around education. Bror Saxberg has been another really big influence on me. And I love geeking out on the learning sciences. I love reading Richard Meyer. I love reading Dan Willingham. I love reading those authors because I learn a heck of a lot. And I like reading people who disagree with each other as well. Maybe that's the last answer. I love reading the disagreements. I love reading a Robert Pendicio. And then I can't think of another example right now, someone on a different viewpoint. And then saying, like, how are they actually saying the same thing? And what are they actually saying that might be different from themselves? Because when you read my works, one of the big fault lines right now in education, that there's several, but is around the importance of content knowledge, right? And there's some people who say, well, you can just Google it. I don't think that's what the cognitive science suggests for a young novice learner. And I also think it's really important that you develop project-based learning as a cornerstone of the learning as you're learning the knowledge. So these poles that sometimes are presented as opposites, I try to find the third way through them, I guess, Kurt, is where I would say, because I think there's truth in all of our corners. And if we can sort of stop talking past each other quite as much, I think we can make a heck of a lot more progress for learners, for parents, for educators, and ultimately that adds up for society.
Well, you've provided a lot of truths today, and we've done this show in less than an hour. So many topics, a wide range of topics that we've covered. It's been a really amazing show. And you've also given us some people we need to invite in, such as Richard Mayer, who's a good friend of mine, and I'm sure Chris has picked up a couple of notes in Punya as well. But it comes a time, even though we want to keep going, and maybe we'll get you back in the show when we do kind of a historical show, when we bring back prior guests. I'm going to put you at the top of the list. But we have to introduce next week. And next week's special to me because we're going to feature my university, Indiana University, where I spent the past 30 odd years in a demonstration site for technology and education, the building I work in. But we're more than that. We're going to feature, we're remodeling the building, and our dean, who was the vice president of learning technologies, her name's Stacy Maroney, will be coming in, as well as the director of a Mosaic project, Tracy Birdwell. She'll be talking about the Active Learning Spaces project, along with Stacy, the two of them, and Mark Russell, who's the manager of learning technology at IU. The three of them will talk about various projects going on, not just in Bloomington, definitely Indianapolis, maybe some of the other campuses. So that will be the first time that we'll be discussing space. So the session will be titled Active Learning Space, the Final Frontier. I hope you can come with us to that show and explore the outer reaches here on this planet, not up in the skies that the Webb telescope is showing us nowadays. So please come next week. And thank you again, Michael, for a wonderful show.
Thank you.